I'm going to start sort of where Callie left off, which is with the current context. Lurking at the back of the current General Synod agenda, awaiting to be discussed, is a private member's motion, which reads that this Synod affirm the public doctrine of marriage between a man and a woman, as set out in the Book of Common Prayer, as the only basis for engagement with public policy on marriage and family life. I don't want us to debate that private member's motion in this session.
Oh, I think we could.
I think we could. And in a sense, I don't want now to have a debate about the real issue that private member's motion is indicating. But I'm fascinated by what we mean when we talk about the public doctrine of marriage between a man and a woman as set out in the Book of Common Prayer. When we're talking about doctrine as set out in the Book of Common Prayer, we're talking about how the Church of England prays and how it derives its theology from the way we pray, how our liturgy and practice inform one another. When we're talking about the doctrine of marriage as set out in the Book of Common Prayer, we're not talking just about the prayer book itself or any particular version of it. We're also talking about a series of adjunct texts. We're talking about the 39 Articles and the homilies, which have an official status because they are listed in the 39 Articles of Religion. So we're talking about the prayer book, the homilies, and the articles. What I want to do, though, is to start by thinking about what marriage looked like in 16th century England, about how marriage changed in the course of the Reformation, and then for us to look quite closely at some of those texts that I've just mentioned. Marriage in 16th century England was not as we might have expected it to be, and in many ways it didn't change that much as the Reformation happened. Throughout the 16th century, the average age for a man to get married was about 27, 28 years old. This is first marriage, this isn't second marriages. Women, on average, made their first marriage at about 25. By the time you were 21, you did not need your parents' consent to marry. That's all quite important. We're not talking about adolescents, essentially, going straight from one household at a very young age into another household. And we're clearly not talking on the whole about marriages between much older men and much younger women on the whole. Marriage was difficult to dissolve. Henry VIII discovered that. But marriages that were lifelong were quite often not the only marriage people would have, because so many women died in childbirth, because of the prevalence of plague, because for the poorer members of society, the prevalence of famine in the 16th century, people married several times in the course of their life. So from their mid-20s, they might well marry 3 or 4 times, have 3 or 4 separate partners, and that was the basis on which marriage took place. Marriages had an official status in the church and a semi-official status in common life. Ceremonies of contracting and hand fasting were held to be binding, though the church did not recognise them as the basis for legitimate children, and that becomes important. So when people decided to marry one another, quite often they had what was called a hand fasting ceremony, a pre-contract, in which they declared their intention and their consent to marry, quite often using the words of the marriage vows. These were held to be legally binding, such that when your banns were called, if you were pre-contracted to somebody else, it was a basis on which the marriage couldn't take place. You didn't have to have been married in church. If you were pre-contracted, it was more than a statement of intent. It was legally binding. Now, neither the medieval church nor the Reformation Church of England recognised that pre-contracted marriage as a legitimate context for sexual activity. you were not supposed to be sleeping with your pre-contracted marriage partner. However, the fact that consistently around 30% of children are born within 8 months of a marriage date seems to suggest that a lot of people went from a pre-contracted marriage to official church and publicly recognised marriage when they realised they were expecting a child and they needed the child to be legitimate, particularly if they owned property. If you didn't own property, it essentially didn't matter so much. So there's a difference as you go down the social strata as to what becomes important in these decisions. So there's all that. During the English Reformation, the Church of England, so from the Reformation onwards, the Church of England had vast monopoly on how marriages were conducted. You couldn't really be married in your parish church unless you were married according to the rites of the Church of England, unless you had a compliant Catholic priest, patron, somebody who wasn't terribly interested. But for the marriage to be registered in any way, to go in the marriage registers, it would need to be according to the rites of the Church of England. So the Church of England had more control over public marriage during the 16th and 17th centuries than at any time since. And until the 1753 Hardwicke Marriage Act, there was no other legitimate way in English law for people to be married to one another. So that's important. Marriages were to be as today in the Church of England, by banns or by licence. Licence was expensive. So most people were married by banns. Your banns would be called in your own parish and in any other relevant parishes, as today, in the main Sunday worship on 3 occasions. Banns made much more sense then than they do now. In stable communities where people knew one another and might know who had been pre-contracted to who might be somebody's father's daughter, who might be any number of things why people couldn't marry. Banns made sense then, and so they were a way of bringing private relationships into the public, recognised, legitimate sphere. But marriages weren't all as exactly per the rubric of the Book of Common Prayer. Some were clandestine. Famously, John Donne and his wife Anne were married clandestinely. This did not mean they eloped to some 16th century equivalent of Gretna Green. It meant they were married in a private chapel or outside the canonical hours, which were then deemed to be 8 in the morning and midday. So I discovered. But most marriages would take place on the course of the main service and leave the afternoon free for partying and other activities. Technically, as in the medieval church, marriages were prohibited during Advent, Lent and on Rogation days. But it seems to have been only the most determined sort of clergy that adhered to that. And it was a cause of real comment and controversy when John Curzon, as rector of Brancepeth in the 1620s, determined that nobody was going to get married during the prohibited seasons. People did, you can tell from the registers, it happened all the time. So there's that. So marriage, essentially, as a social institution, remained in many ways unchanged as the Reformation occurred. In many ways, the way marriage was actually celebrated didn't change very much. The vows with which we're familiar from the Book of Common Prayer were medieval. They had been exchanged in English since long before the Reformation. The main difference in terms of the actual geography, the actual celebration of the marriage, had been that before the Reformation, the vows would be exchanged at the church porch. It would all take place outside. And then the newly married couple would move in to the church building and there would be a mass celebrated at which they might or might not receive communion. What the prayer book asked couples to do, asked the officiating minister to do, was to celebrate the service inside the body of the church And then the rubrics are very clear in the 1549 and every subsequent prayer book that the couple should then receive communion. That was a cause of controversy. So the main change that actually happened in terms of the church's perception of marriages were twofold. One was clearly the controversial issue that clergy could marry. Clergy, it was deemed, actually should marry. So Article 32 on the marriage of priests reads, "Bishops, priests and deacons are not commanded by God's law to vow the state of single life or to abstain from marriage. Therefore it is lawful also for them, as for all other Christian men, to marry at their own discretion, as they shall judge the same, better to serve godliness." There isn't time this afternoon to have a great long conversation about clerical marriage through the Reformation. But from early accounts of Archbishop Cranmer keeping his wife in a chest for fear of the Tudors, it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't straightforward anywhere in Protestant Europe. But as the 16th century progressed, as the Reformation took hold in England, a minister was deemed that he should marry and that he should set an example of the godly household in his parish. And there's a whole lot of practical divinity to that end. And it's written through the 1580s into 1590s about what the godly household looks like. And if you're interested in that, Alec Ryer's recent book on Being Protestant really explores some of what the godly household might have felt like from the inside, what people thought it should feel like, look like, how a godly household should be modelled. So clergy could marry. There were obviously more people available on the marriage market once the monastic houses had been dissolved in the 1530s. Before the Reformation, across medieval Europe, there was that option for a socially acceptable, religiously sanctioned, non-married life. That option went at the Reformation, meaning that women had no option, really, other than to remain in their parents' household or to move into their husband's household, albeit not till they were in their mid-20s. There wasn't another way open for them. I think that's quite important as we come to think about precisely what it is marriage in Reformation England is entailing for people. Once it becomes the only option, and this is how a godly household is modelled, it makes a difference to how people live. The Church construed marriage differently, clearly, and that's reflected also in the 39 Articles. In Article 25, hitherto marriage had been deemed a sacrament. Article 25 says it isn't one, it's a state of life. Along with confirmation, penance, orders and extreme unction, it is not to be counted as a sacrament of the gospel. And it's deemed to have become such, having grown partly out of the corrupt following of the apostles, and partly because it's recognised by the article that there is something of religious value about these states of life, that they are in some sense holy, but they're not sacraments. And so it shouldn't be thought of as a ceremony ordained by God, because it has no visible sign. So we come to the prayer book. And the prayer book is institutionalising marriage. It's saying this is what the Church in England believes about marriage. And what does it say? It says first that it's a gift of God in creation. It's a gift of God in creation. So marriage is somehow derived from the created order itself. It isn't something that has been instituted, and the liturgy appeals both to Adam and Eve and sees marriage as something that is a natural part of the created order. And it's this version of marriage that is a natural part of the created order. It's seen further as signifying the union between Christ and the Church. it's interesting that in a situation where there's an increasing development of covenant theology, as importance of England as some sort of new holy nation Israel, there's no sense of the echoes of the marriage between God and Israel imagery used in the Old Testament. That's just not there. That language of covenant isn't particularly there. What's interesting is that it's the authority for marriage is derived from creation itself, and that it is seen as a symbol of the relationship between Christ and the church. And it's given for three purposes. It's given in order. For the procreation of children, that they may be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord. It's to increase the godly household. It's for a remedy against sin. It is to regulate sexual behaviour. All those things that Callie was talking about regulating desire, finding ways of putting into official constraints sexual activity. It's for that. And it's thirdly for the mutual society, help and comfort of the one to the other. When Martin Butzer criticised the 1549 prayer book, he thought they should be listed the other way round. He thought mutual society, help and comfort should come first. But they weren't. They weren't rearranged. But there's very little change between the subsequent versions of the prayer book. After we've heard the purposes of marriage, the couple are invited to give their consent and to exchange their vows. And then the man will give a ring. 1549, the ring is accompanied, as in medieval practice, by gold and silver and other tokens of spousing, unspecified. That's customary tokens. And that the gold and silver and any other tokens, along with the ring, will be laid on the book. And then the famous words with which the husband takes the ring and weds his wife. This is unchanged, except the gold and silver go in 1552.
Would it be helpful if I put this up on the wall?
Oh, can you put that up? Oh, she can put it up on the wall, wow.
You might not be able to read it, of course, but...
I was going to say, I've got lots of... We can read the detailed texts, but...
Carry on and it will come up. You will get the BCP 1552
magically
appearing in a minute.
What joy. The couple are then pronounced husband and wife. The marriage is blessed. They kneel at the altar and prayers are said. It becomes the communion table in 1552, but that's not important. What's interesting is that these prayers appeal entirely to the Old Testament. Not just to any bits of the Old Testament. They appeal to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. The women appeal, and the women are enjoined to be as patient as Sarah. And the interest is entirely in the patriarchal history of the Old Testament. And I think that's important. I think that relates to the derivation of marriage as in creation. It's back then, way back. This is how it is. This is how it ever shall be. And there are none of those problematic passages referenced at all. There's much less Bible, actually, in the prayer book rite than there is that concatenation of biblical texts that we find in the Common Worship Preface. There isn't this imagery from all over the place. This is how it is. This is the biblical foundation for it. And then the biblical texts that are explored further are the household code from Ephesians particularly, but also from Colossians and 1 Peter. It's explored, if a sermon isn't preached, the couple will be reminded of the duties of marriage, and the duties will be spelled out as in Ephesians 5, that husbands should love their wives and wives should be subject to their husbands. This, I think, is interesting when we come to think about what we mean by the public doctrine of marriage. Because as it becomes clear in the two relevant homilies, the 1547 First Book of Homilies includes a homily wonderfully entitled A Sermon Against Whoredom and Uncleanness. And the 1563 Book of Homilies is on the state of matrimony. But it's very clear in the 1563 homilies that women are to be viewed entirely as the weaker vessel, incapable of agency, of self-regulation, or of making decisions, of behaving as godly matrons jolly well should, without the direction of their husbands. And so the homily wonderfully reads that a woman is a weak creature, not endued with like strength as her husband, and constancy of mind. It appeals to, again, back to the patriarch, saying Sarah obeyed Abraham and calling him Lord, then appeals to 1 Peter, saying you should follow her example. All this tends to a view of matrimony that is so culturally conditioned, as Joran was saying this morning, that it's hard to know where we go with it as we start to think about it as our public expression of marriage. The 1563 homily is clear that men should not beat their wives. It is clear that men should love their wives. But the reasons given are nothing to do with romantic concern. And this is not an idea that's totally alien in the 16th century. It's not an idea that's alien once we've done the Renaissance and courtly love and all the wonderful poetry we get in Renaissance English about love. But it's not there in the prayer book and it's not there in the homilies. It is not part of the way that the Reformation Church of England construes marriage. So as we think about marriage as being derived from creation, as being set way back in the days of the patriarchs, and all the examples being those of the early history from Israel, so we think about the picture this gives. It opens up a series of questions as we start to think how we construe our own liturgy and doctrine, reflecting faithfully the liturgy and doctrine that has formed the Church of England. The Church of England has got some big questions, it seems to me, to answer on this one. And so I'm really pleased that we're having this opportunity, because I think one of the reasons why we've got into such a mess is not that we don't know what we think about gay marriage, it's that we don't know what we think about marriage at all. We don't know what we think the purpose of Christian marriage in contemporary society is. As a slight nod to another controversial issue that was also raised this morning, I think it's very important when we're discussing issues of marriage and the ordering of society and the household, particularly the godly household, that we really interrogate the assumptions and questions that are being built in to discussions of headship, of control, and of what is God-given and what is socially conditioned through the ages.